So the Irish built environment consists of about 36% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, and these are comprised of operational emissions and embodied carbon emissions. Operational carbon emissions are the emissions due to the day-to-day operation of a building or an asset. These would typically include things like your energy use, your heating, your cooling, your water use, your waste management, and also maintenance of the asset. These correspond to about 23% of our greenhouse gas emissions. The embodied carbon emissions are around 13%, and these are the emissions associated with the embodied carbon of the construction as it's built. Emissions can be either direct or indirect. Direct emissions are emissions from sources that are owned and controlled by a firm. Emissions from fossil fuels burned on site, so that could be gas from boilers, oil from diesel from generators, and fleet vehicles. Direct emissions also include things like refrigerant leakage from refrigerant systems. Indirect emissions are emissions that are as a consequence of the firm's activities but are not owned and controlled by the firm. Some examples then of indirect emissions would include the transportation and extraction of raw materials, so things like cement and steel, emissions due to those. Also things like employee commuting, waste, water. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the most widely used framework for measuring the emissions due to a firm, and this divides the emissions into 3 scopes. Scope 1 emissions are emissions directly from a firm due to the combustion of fossil fuels. Scope 2 emissions are indirect, and these include things like electricity. Scope 3 emissions are emissions from the value chain or the supply chain of a firm, and they're indirect, and also things like employee commuting and capital goods purchase, for example. These emissions are usually by far and away the biggest emissions of a firm. So increasingly firms are being required to measure their footprint for regulatory purposes. With the introduction of the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, large firms are now required to report on their carbon footprint in their annual report. Small firms who are in the value chain of these larger organisations must contribute to this process also. So it's often said that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. So once you start to measure your carbon footprint and set your baseline, the next logical step is how do you reduce it? Most firms will want to reduce their emissions and set targets that are science-based, and this will help them plot their trajectory out to 2030 and to 2050 in net zero.